That difficulty was intensified when, after pleading guilty and accepting his sentences as part of a plea bargain, Anthony then filed an appeal, and then a series of appeals, wanting to change his plea to not guilty, wanting to have his sentences reduced. At that point, my grief, which had been overwhelming, turned to resentment and rage. I was furious at him, who had slaughtered our daughter, now wanted to get out of paying the consequences, which he had agreed to, for goodness sakes. Sure. I was just livid.
Sure.
I was in church near the anniversary of Shannon's death, the first anniversary of her murder, and John Crest, the chaplain who had notified us of her death, was preaching that Sabbath morning, not knowing my struggle for the last several weeks, trying to deal with this internal resentment and rage toward Anthony. His text that morning was about how we as Christians ought to experience and share God's love with those around us. And from his text, I jumped to several other things Jesus had said about loving other people, and ended up remembering Jesus saying, "Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you and despitefully use you." And that morning, that text just devastated me, because I had tried and tried to do that, and I could not make it happen. I realized that that I needed rescue, not just from my irritation at little things that people might have done to frustrate me, but this was really who I was at the core of myself, an angry, resentful, destructive human being. And I thought of myself that morning as spiritually bankrupt, somebody who needed God's grace in as profound a way as Anthony needed it in his prison cell in Maryland. And that connection between myself and the man who had slaughtered Shannon was humiliating to me. I had never felt so far from God as I did at that moment. And it wasn't but just a very short time, while I was sitting there in the pew that morning, that I remembered another text from Romans chapter 5. Paul said, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Very seldom would somebody die for somebody else, but if it was a really good person, maybe somebody might be willing to die. But God showed his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And I realized at that moment that it wasn't just Daryl who was upset at a playmate taking a toy away from him in school, or at a slow driver who was delaying him on the road. It was Daryl's, the angry, internally distressed, destructive sinner that Jesus died for. And he loved me when I hated myself. And at that moment, all the symptoms of my rage were gone. The tight stomach, the clenched jaw, the tense fists, it was all gone. And I was relaxed for the first time in weeks. And for me, that was a miracle that showed me that in those extreme traumatic circumstances, forgiveness is not a goal I set for myself. It is a gift that God gives me.